nonpartisan student organization that hosts free debates, panels, and talks on the UC Berkeley campus. Before we get started with our event this evening, I ask everyone to please silence and put away your phones and laptops. Also, if you have questions, there will be an opportunity to ask them at the end. But I'm so excited to announce our exciting debate this evening on affirmative action. Our student moderator for the evening, Omatara, is going to come up in a minute to introduce the order of the event and how the whole format's going to work. So without further ado, our moderator for the evening, Omatara Aluya.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for attending tonight's session of the Berkeley Forum, a debate on affirmative action. The format of this event will be as follows. I will introduce each of the speakers, and one by one, they will present a brief 3-minute overview of their position. Following this, we will move into a more moderated cross-examination portion. Our first speaker for tonight is Mr. K. Wilson. He's on the pro side and will be speaking on favor of affirmative action. John K. Wilson is a 2019-2020 fellow with the University of California National Center on Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and he has a residency at UC Berkeley. He is the co-editor of the academyblog.org for the American Association of University Professors, the co-founder of the Evanston Literary Festival, and the author of 8 books, including The Myth of Political Correctness, The Conservative Attack on Higher Education, Patriotic Correctness, Academic Freedom and Its Enemies, The Most Dangerous Man in America, Rush Limbaugh's Assault on Reason, and President Trump Unveiled, Exposing the Bigoted Billionaire. Thank you.
All available on Amazon.com.
I want to quickly start off. I apologize for reading this, but I want to stay within the time limit. I think there are many arguments for affirmative action college admissions, ranging from diversity to equity. But I think one of the strongest arguments that I want to focus on is about advantages and disadvantages. When colleges admit students, they should be looking not just for achievement, but potential. Who has the best potential for future achievement, and who is most likely to get the most out of that college's education? So how do colleges measure the potential futures of students? Obviously, past achievement is the primary component, but colleges should also look at the advantages and disadvantages faced by a student as a way to look at their potential. Suppose there are 2 students applying to a college who have roughly equal records of achievement. One of the students has benefited from a vast number of advantages in life, a wealthy, privileged background with elite schools, tutors, lessons, test prep, and every possible advantage that money can buy. The other student has overcome numerous disadvantages, growing up in a segregated, high-crime area with inadequate schools and lacking many of the advantages that the wealthy take for granted. I think many of us would argue that the disadvantaged student should get the admissions preference in this kind of case and be given a place over the advantaged student, because the disadvantaged student has greater potential and in fact has shown greater achievement in terms of overcoming what they've done in their life. So the question is race one of those disadvantages that should be considered in college admissions? And I think this question comes down to is, does racism still exist in America, and does it harm the people or disadvantage the people who experience it? And I think the answer to those questions is yes, and I believe the evidence is overwhelming for that. In that case, colleges should consider race and racism in admissions. The only question is how they ought to do it, not if it ought to be considered. Now I want to focus first just a quick minute on the fact that affirmative action is a relatively minor program that helps a small number of students from underrepresented groups at a small number of elite colleges, mostly. And yet the public perceives affirmative action as an enormous advantage that underrepresented minorities have. And to show that, let me quote America's leading expert on ignorant ideas, Donald Trump. Donald Trump in 2016 tweeted, quote, "Goofy Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton's flunky, has a career that is totally based on a lie. She is not a Native American," end quote. According to Trump, quote, "She was able to get into various schools because of the fact she applied as a Native American and probably able to get other things," end quote. And in fact, this is a lie, that Elizabeth Warren never got any advantages in college admissions. And in fact, she grew up in poverty and overcame enormous disadvantages. And by contrast, Donald Trump and his family did get admissions, special preferences into colleges. Donald Trump in particular was admitted to an elite school, elite high school, because his father was on the governing board of the school. And then he received a preference in terms of getting into the University of Pennsylvania because the admissions officer who interviewed him was a friend of his brother. And so these are the kind of advantages from elites that they receive, from legacy preferences to advantages that are given to the wealthy. And so Donald Trump has this lie in his tax about Elizabeth Warren. He's a hypocrite because he is in fact the one who has received these preferences. And he's a racist because he thinks that anyone who benefits from affirmative action has a career totally based on these minor admissions preferences. So I think Donald Trump is a perfect example of why we need affirmative action, to offset the enormous advantages that those who have a wealthy, white, privileged background receive in life. And instead of going after affirmative action to help people who have been disadvantaged, we ought to unite against discriminatory practices that favor whites over Asian Americans in colleges, and against the legacy preferences and wealth preferences that give undeserved favoritism and to privileged elites like Donald Trump.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Our first speaker for tonight will be Mr. Yukong Zhao. Mr. Yukong Zhao is a distinguished Chinese-American civil rights activist, the co-founder and president of the Asian American Coalition for Education, AACE, and the author of the book, The Chinese Secrets for Success, 5 Inspiring Confucian Values. Since 2014, Mr. Zhao has been leading Asian Americans' fight against the admissions discrimination by Harvard University and many other educational institutions nationwide. Under Mr. Zhao's leadership, AACE has made a difference on equal education rights for all Americans, including federal adoption of the AACE's policy recommendation on college admissions, federal civil rights investigation of Harvard University and Yale University. AACE has also provided strong support to Asian Americans' fight against educational discrimination in Maryland, New York City, and Washington State. Mr. Zhao also contributes columns in Orlando Centennial, Forbes, Daily Caller, The World Journal, Sing Tao Daily, and India West to promote Chinese culture and conservative voices. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for Berkeley Forum and also to everyone attending this important debate. Any government policy with one major defect should be discontinued. Affirmative action, distorted as race-based college admission, has at least 4 major defects. First, it creates social injustice. According to Princeton professor Thomas Espenscheder, in order to get equal chance to get accepted by selective colleges, Asian American students have to score 140 points than white students, 270 points than Hispanic students, and 450 points than black students on SAT. In 2012, Ron Arms further revealed that Ivy League schools have been using the de facto racial quotas to limit Asian American enrollment. Higher admission standard, racial quotas, plus racial stereotype has led to overwhelming, unbearable study burden, depression, and serious psychological issue, even suicide among Asian American children. And I also want to emphasize, affirmative action also really put a high preference for well-off Hispanic, black leaders like President Obama. People challenge why President Obama, his well-off family, why their children deserved any preference. That's a question I want the audience to think about that. Number 2, it fails to help the intended beneficiaries. The real reason behind the lack of racial diversity in higher education is failing K-12 education in too many black and Hispanic communities. 59 years after its inception, affirmative action has failed miserably to lift up black and Hispanic children their education. A 2017 New York Times article correctly pointed out, even with affirmative action, Black and Hispanics are more underrepresented at the top universities than 35 years ago. Number 3, race-based college admission undermines America's founding principle, namely meritocracy and equal opportunity. Equal opportunity is the cornerstone of the American dream. Number 4, affirmative action harms American national interest. Race-based college admission rejects better qualified Asian American students, especially those who are good at STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. As such, affirmative action exacerbates Americans' shortage of STEM talents, jeopardizing our technology leadership in the world and also national security. There are many articles about that. In summary, affirmative action in today's practice have 4 major policy defects should be immediately stopped. It is a modern-day injustice imposed by American elite class. The ruling elite class sacrifices Asian Americans as political scapegoats to cover up their persistent failure to help improve K-12 education for Black and for Hispanic community. That is cover up Asian American. Unfortunately, historically in Chinese Exclusion Act 1.5 century ago been discriminated. Today we are also being discriminated by this kind of race-based policy. Thank you.
Our second pro speaker for tonight will be Miss Catherine Clayton. Catherine Clayton is a political science PhD student at Stanford University studying American politics and comparative politics. Her research focuses on democratic norms, political misperceptions, and identity politics, and her work has been published in Political Behavior and Politics, Groups and Identities, among others. Her book, Campus Diversity, The Hidden Consensus, co-authored with John Kerry and Yusaku Furuichi, reveals a surprising consensus and preferences in favor of increased diversity in undergraduate admissions and faculty recruitment among college students across the nation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the intro, and thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but again, I'm actually here today to talk a little bit more about not my own preferences, but the preferences for diversity or in favor of affirmative action among college students and faculty. So the book that was just mentioned was a project that I worked on for several years with 2 professors at Dartmouth College, and the question that we were interested in answering was, what do campus communities really think about affirmative action? And the reason that we had that question was because there are a lot of mixed results, especially when you look at survey data, and a lot of that survey data comes down to just the way that the question is asked. So, for example, there was a Gallup poll in February 2019 that found that 61% of Americans favor affirmative action programs for minorities, but at the same time, another poll conducted in the same month by the Research Center found that 75% of Americans believe colleges should not consider applicants' race or ethnicity when considering them for admission. So those are some very conflicting results, and we thought, well, how can we reconcile these misleading findings? And in fact, it would be very important to understand what campus communities think if we were going to think about whether affirmative action should be a policy that we have. So the study that we did used a unique method known as conjoint analysis to try to parse this out. And conjoint analysis is actually a methodological technique that was borrowed from marketing research. And the goal of that technique was to be able to parse out all the different characteristics that go into a given decision and measure how much each one of them matter. So what we did was we conducted surveys across the nation at lots of different colleges and universities. And in those surveys, we pitted these hypothetical candidates for faculty recruitment and for undergraduate admissions, which is the focus of our talk today, against each other. And each one of these candidates had a whole suite of characteristics. So they had extracurricular activities, they had gender, they had race and ethnicity, they had socioeconomic status, test scores, high school class rank, you name it, most of the things that would go into real-life college admissions decisions. And then we asked students to choose between them, to choose which applicant they would rather see admitted at their school. And using this method, over thousands and thousands of pairwise comparisons like that, we could determine, okay, what are the factors that actually drive decisions the most? Are they merit only? Are they race and ethnicity? And how do we parse those out? And when we got the results, we were able to actually say, all else equal, if we had 2 applicants that were exactly the same on every single characteristic except one, say race, which one would be chosen? And we were pretty surprised to find that across the board, every single group of students, for the most part, that we looked at, was in favor of admitting candidates and student applicants who had been traditionally underrepresented. So minorities, low-income students, even women who are not actually underrepresented anymore in college admissions were favored compared to men, to whites, and to higher-income students. And so looking at all these results, we thought, well, this is a pretty good argument in favor of affirmative action, given that it seems that campus communities, those who are most impacted by these decisions, seem to be generally in favor of increased diversity. So just in thinking about this debate, we should be thinking about what do these campus communities think, and using this technique, we're able to find these surprising and potentially very important preferences.
Thank you. And finally, our second con speaker for tonight will be Li Cheng. Li Cheng is an attorney and civil rights activist with a long history of achievements in business, law, and public policy. He is presently a partner at Vashoff Brennan, a leading technology-focused law firm with offices in Utah and California, and the co-founder and president of Symmetry IP, an organization focused on fighting patent abuse. Lee is a 2-time winner, 2014 and 2016, of the National Law Journal's America's 50 Outstanding General Counsel, the inaugural recipient of the Champion of Equal Opportunity Education Rights Award of the Asian American Coalition for Education, and has been given numerous other awards for innovation and excellence in the practice of law. Lee has been deeply involved in business and community groups, including the board of directors of the Atlantic Legal Foundation, the board of directors of the Publius Lex, the board of industry leaders of the Consumer Technology Association, and the board of trustees of the CTA Foundation. In 1994, he served as secretary and a director of the Asian American Legal Foundation. He previously served on the boards of the Association of Corporate Counsels Southern California chapter and the Harvard Club of San Francisco, the Lowell High School Alumni Association, the Organization of Chinese Americans San Francisco chapter, and AACE. He is also a graduate of Harvard University History of Science, magna cum laude, and the University of California, Berkeley School of Law.
Thank you, Omitar. So thank you all of you for coming here tonight, and for the Berkeley Forum for having me. I have many, many fond memories of this campus. This has been the institution that's educated most of my family, and I lived here for 3 years myself. I've been interested in or have worked on affirmative action related issues now for almost 3 decades, or over 3 decades, since I was a teenager attending high school right across the bay at Lowell High School, which incidentally just got cordoned off for coronavirus. But I'll share the details shortly. Just to clarify, I actually am not here to attack or criticize affirmative action, so you're kind of here on your own, buddy. You know, I support affirmative action. I support diversity, right? It's really very much a definitional issue. What does it mean, right? Everything John said and everything Catherine said, it all sounds great. I support all of that. I even support consideration of race, right, as one of many factors outlined in the Bakke decision in 1974. One of many factors, one of many equal factors, right? The problem is that that's not how these programs have been implemented for much of the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years. I know this because I saw it. I became interested in the affirmative action issue because I saw how poorly these programs were implemented starting back in the 70s and 80s. In 1984, when I applied to Lowell High School in San Francisco, an affirmative action program was in place, technically in place. But there was just nothing affirmative about racial discrimination because it required students who were specifically Chinese, of Chinese descent, to score numerically higher than even white students. Socioeconomics were not a factor. Skin color and ethnicity were all that mattered. You know, and we can talk about using race as a tipping factor when all else is equal. Totally supporting. I get it, right? but it's not that equal. I've been involved in school admissions, looking at programs like Lowell High School or even Harvard College admissions. I've been interviewing now for Harvard College admissions for 27 years. It is not equal. We're not talking about tipping two kids with substantially equal applications. We're talking about vast, huge gaps in qualifications, in experience, in effort expended, in everything that's measurable or objective, right? And the gaps are completely race-based. And who falls at the bottom of the pit and gets screwed every single time? It's Asian Americans. Unequivocally, it's Asian Americans. We were screwed, at Lowell High School, and I think it was very, very clear when I applied to Berkeley. We're kind of screwed when we applied to Berkeley and all the UCs. We got jacked when we applied to Harvard. Everybody knew that if you're Asian, you just had to do more. And considering the horrific history of abuse against Asians in America, as long as there have been Asians in America, it seems particularly ironic that the same thing is happening all over again, using as an excuse a program that's supposed to help people who have been historically disadvantaged. There's nothing wrong with helping people who are disadvantaged. There's nothing wrong with considering race. It's how much you consider race. It's how much weight you put on that factor. It's not a thumb on the scale now. It's a different scale. That's just wrong.
Thank you for all of your addresses. We will now be moving into the cross-examination stage of this debate, where I will be asking questions to all of our speakers, and we will alternate between the pro and con sides as they provide their answers. So for the first question, we'll be starting off with the con side, Mr. Zhao.
Okay.
In your speech, you talked about the discrimination against Asian and Asian Americans, which represent 5.6% of the U.S. population, but over 25% of Harvard's admitted class of 2023. How, if at all, should we balance individual identities versus group identities in the context of affirmative action?
I think this country is built upon individual freedom and also emphasize individual rights. We should never take into account the group identity. And the concept is wrong because I want to give you an example. It really challenges the fundamental, people talk about diversity. People, I think, wrongly equate the value of diversity, which should be diversity of ideas, good ideas, and to the diversity of a racial group. In China, we have the famous university called Minzu University of China. Is it's really all the ethnicity of this kind of university. It meets all the criteria you define. People, all the different racial group will have a spot there. But that university, if you check from the international rating, you find all kinds of is far below famous university like Peking University, University of Science and Technology of China. Why is that? Because they reverse what's the objective by education. All education is not should be the focus is really educate qualified individuals to be able to achieve their American dream, to be able to help build this country as continue to be greatest nation on earth. It's not safe to do a racial balancing. So from social progress, I will standpoint, I will fully support bring up more black, more Hispanic into the top school, good schools. Absolutely is the right thing to do. But use that just racial balancing as objective, forcefully claim racial diversity necessarily brings the education value. No, it's not. Peking University pick the best student from the nation. So Peking University is the best one in China. That they call the Minzu University of China is not the best one. So that is totally aligned in over exaggeration. So we should going back to the fundamental, which is education purpose. How to bring everybody up. When bring everybody up, I support give more training, more education, more resources to Hispanic and Black community, improve the K-12 education, but not jeopardize the integrity of our like test system, like admission system, meritocracy should be, our funding principle continue to be.
Mr. Wilson?
I want to say that I oppose racial quotas. I think that's not what affirmative action is, about trying to create a certain number of people of every race at every institution. I want to quote to you some things that were in a book I wrote back, this came out in 1995.
He's old.
I'm old. And one of the things I wrote about in this was about defending affirmative action, but writing about some of the discrimination that was being used to essentially attack affirmative action. That the discrimination against Asian Americans and in favor of whites at elite colleges was being used to try and attack affirmative action in general for underrepresented minorities. And that I thought was to attack blacks and Hispanics. And I thought that was particularly ironic because, of course, what was happening was that what colleges were doing, they were discriminating for white people. And that was being used as an attack on affirmative action. And this was happening at Berkeley, among other places. This is the Berkeley Assistant Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Affairs in 1986. Quote, "We could fill up half the freshman class with Asians, but that wouldn't be acceptable to the legislature. If we keep getting extremely well-prepared Asians, and we may get to the point where whites are an affirmative action group." And that's something that I strongly oppose. Again, based on the advantage and disadvantage model, that you should not be trying to set a certain number of set-asides for white people in a college class simply to appease the legislature or to create a racial quota. That you have to look at the idea of racism and racial disadvantage. And speaking as a white person, I don't have any racial disadvantage. This is all privilege sitting up here. And that's why when you're talking about comparing having whites and Asians, there shouldn't be that kind of discrimination against Asians. But we can speak out against discrimination against Asians and still defend affirmative action for underrepresented minorities, and we should. And so I think that, in essence, that's something that we ought to agree on, that we're not going to support discriminating for white people. We ought to get rid of these kind of preferences in various forms for white people that elite colleges have, but at the same time maintain an idea of affirmative action for disadvantaged minorities.
Mr. Chang?
I agree. I think, with a lot of what John said and a lot of what Catherine said. I said that earlier, right? I support affirmative action. We should all be in support of programs that help disadvantaged people, individuals, right? At the end of the day, the diversity, true diversity exists at an individual level. There is tremendous, race is to a large extent a social construct. There is a lot of diversity within every single community, and we should be focusing on disadvantage. We should not be making a stereotype. Just think about that, right? A stereotype, an assumption that everybody of a certain race is privileged or advantaged. Not every white person is advantaged. Not every white person is as handsome as you are. There's a lot of variation within people of the same ethnic group. And there are people who are in what are called underrepresented. What does underrepresentation even mean, right? Underrepresentation is taken to mean, a group, members of a group, there are fewer members of the group than exist in a certain population, right? But what does it mean in terms of, how it impacts, is impacted by individual rights and preferences, right? It shouldn't prevent people from doing what they actually want to do. Affirmative action should be all about allowing people to realize their dreams and earn dreams. And if we want to have affirmative action, the focus should be on the disadvantage of the individual as opposed to assuming that everybody in certain groups is automatically and incredibly disadvantaged. As Yukong pointed out, there are black people and Hispanics who are very privileged, right? President Obama himself made the point a couple of years ago when he was president that he thought it was kind of strange that his children might be considered disadvantaged, right? There are white people who are disadvantaged, and they should be considered under affirmative action programs as well. Keep affirmative action, is my view, but mend it, right? Amend it. Make it so that it's means-based. Make it so that it's focused on disadvantage. Make it not racist, because as it's implemented, it's so easy. It has been so easy. You know, to your point, right? And I greatly appreciate the fact that you acknowledge the fact that race preference programs called affirmative action programs have harmed in Asian Americans in elite college admissions. A lot of people for years refused to acknowledge even that point. At Lowell High School, the program was in place for 20 years before we sued them, right? And many people called us, you know, called the Asian American community in Chinese American community racist, right, for challenging that program. Then I want to ask you, if you oppose those programs and discrimination against Asian Americans, why hasn't anybody who supports affirmative action come out and oppose those programs that discriminate against Asian Americans? I've not seen one. So that's why we're challenging these programs. We're not trying to end affirmative action. We're trying to end discrimination based on race, specifically now against Asian Americans. Very simple.
Ms. Clayton?
Sure, so I just wanted to respond to one point that's been made a couple times and made earlier, again about student preferences, but one thing that we did examine was whether there, for example, differential rates of return to increasing or decreasing test scores. So there's this going narrative like, yes, if you have two completely equal applicants and they differ only in race, should you be picking one or the other, when in reality a lot of the time maybe people are not equal on every single characteristic. But if we think about cases where there are multiple things that differ, for example, test scores and race, something like that, we actually find that there aren't differential rates of return. So students and faculty, both when evaluating these hypothetical applicants, tend to reward increasing test scores as much as they punish decreasing test scores, regardless of race. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, regardless of whether that matches up with data. For example, we were talking about the Espen shade data of the returns of increasing test scores, how much in observational data these things matter. I think student preferences do not demonstrate any types of differential rates of return. So maybe we're moving more towards a holistic way of evaluating people in terms of student preferences, and maybe that's something that we could be translating a little bit into actual admissions decisions, because I would agree that a holistic process that really takes everything into account is probably the ideal. It's difficult to implement in practice, I'm sure, but I think many of us are on the same page that that's something that matters. If I may, I mean, we're in the 21st century, and this is the era of big data. Everything is quantifiable, right? In the Harvard admissions process, in which I've been involved in, they quantify everything. They actually define personality. There are ways to define different ways you can score personality. They define extracurriculars, achievement levels, academics. And so it is all quantifiable. The problem that I think many people are having with admissions programs now is the fact that there are people who want to be able to say, I can decide because I feel like it, behind a closed door, because I think this is what the class should look like, and I can discriminate if I want to. Okay, and that's actually what's been happening in a lot of these holistic admissions programs. And it's very unfortunate, and it's got to stop. As a matter of law, it's got to stop.
A key argument, as Ms. Clayton and we've seen today, is the argument against affirmative action around observed difference in standardized testing scores between admitted applicants of different ethnicities. Given the flaws that some have pointed out with such testing, what, if any, do you see as an ideal metric for comparing students during the application process? And we'll start with Mr. Wilson.
Well, I think it is important to note that actually standardized testing was created in order to engage in discrimination. That elite colleges in the early 20th century had a problem that they thought there were too many Jews applying to their colleges, and the Jews were high achieving and tended to do well in school, and so they were trying to figure out different ways to keep out the Jews. And one of the ways it turned out was creating these standardized tests that often had deeply Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP cultural biases to them. And there were lots of other things, like the geographic preference was created because many of the Jews came from New York City, and so these elite colleges will establish a preference for people from different areas of the country as a way to keep Jews out. as one tool of doing this. And so I think there is an element to which that reliance on standardized testing can reflect kind of discriminatory effects. It gets a little tricky. Of course, Berkeley's faculty recently came out to continue using standardized testing in Berkeley admissions. And it is a reality that a lot of the standardized testing in some ways reflects student achievement, that it reflects the differences that students have in terms of their opportunities to get an excellent education in different areas of the country. And so, you know, I don't know if there's a great alternative to standardized testing that doesn't replicate the same kinds of effects that people have in terms of their differences in opportunities.
Mr. Chang.
So I think, first of all, John, I think you may want to reread history, because standardized tests actually were part of the reason why there were so many Jews in the Ivy Leagues. So Jewish applicants were doing very, very well on grades and on standardized tests, right? Because you know what? Once you post standards, you know, people know about standards. People who are willing to work hard and study hard and who value education, right? They can actually go prepare for it. You know, Asian Americans do very well on standardized tests, right? English is my second language. I didn't learn it till I was 5, and yet somehow I figured out what yacht meant. I figured out what a regatta was, right? Because I bought a book and I studied and I memorized the definitions and blah, 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 blah. So the actual history is that the WASPs of the East Coast resented the fact that Jews were getting into Harvard in very, very high numbers. They created, in a complete mirror image of what's happening in our colleges today, they crafted this argument that, you know, Harvard and the Ivies were getting too Jewy, and they wanted diversity. They said we wanted gentlemanly qualities, these intangibles, collegiality, and so they essentially wanted to find ways to water down the impact of objective criteria, which levels the playing field for the poor, levels the playing field for the new immigrants who want to work hard and are willing to work hard. And so they actually first started with a quota, and then people challenged and said, hey, this sucks, this is not right? And then they actually convened a committee to come up with ways to mask the quotas so that they could have the same impact. So it was horrible. The quotas basically made it harder for Jewish applicants to get into medical school in the United States. It was harder for a Jewish student to get into medical school in Roosevelt's America in the 1930s than it was for a Jewish applicant to get into medical school in Mussolini's Italy. Okay, just think about that. And that's what happened when people stopped really focusing on objective criteria and measurable criteria and let people who had other agendas, right, go in and muck around with admissions criteria. So they crafted the whole concept of diversity popped up in the 30s and 40s because of this Harvard committee that came up with the idea, gee, let's use geographical diversity because we can get those corn-fed guys from the Midwest, and there aren't a lot of Jewish people in the Midwest. That's history. I've looked at it very, very carefully, right, because it completely mirrors what's happening today with Asian Americans. There are excuses being made to eliminate objective criteria. Do standardized tests have problems? Absolutely. Are they perfect? Absolutely not, right? Do they have cultural biases? Absolutely. In the absence of standardized testing, think about what the alternative is. It's a bunch of people sitting behind closed doors, right, saying, gee, let's admit whoever we want. Let's let in the children of donors. That's actually exactly what happened. Let's let in the children of donors. Let's let in, nothing wrong with letting in athletes. Let's let in people based on race, which is actually illegal. So let's go back to all of the stuff about people at Stanford, students and faculty saying, I like this, I like that. From a legal perspective, it's irrelevant, okay? Because you cannot, in America, discriminate against someone based on race as a matter of law, as a governmental actor. That's not legal, okay? And I would observe that the people saying that they would prefer someone based on a race are people who are already in the institution and not people who were not allowed to be admitted because of their race. So, there are ways to improve, I think, the admissions process. Eliminating objective criteria is not one of them.
Ms. Clayton?
I think it's interesting that you just said that, for example, yes, test scores have cultural biases, etc. Absolutely. I think that's a really big problem. I think it's not necessarily something that we can sort of just say, yeah, it's not great, but, you know, that's what we have. I think one pretty big movement that I think has some promise is that a lot of schools are going test optional. So there it's up to the student's discretion to talk about whether, or to at least consider whether the test is reflecting their own, their merit, their performance in general. And if it doesn't, you know, there are a whole lot of other things. There are essays, there are things that don't actually show up in a resume, but if you come from a very disadvantaged background and maybe you don't have 17 extracurriculars because you're taking care of your extended family and little siblings, anything like that, I think those things obviously will impact your scores and will not show up in your application. But if schools are going to let people actually make the decision about whether the test scores are a good representation of them as an applicant, and then leave it up to the admissions committees to decide, I don't think that's a bad idea. And I think if you think that your 2400 or your 1600 on the SAT is a very good representation of who you are, then sure, you can submit that. But I don't think that making that the objective criteria for everyone is really fair at all.
Mr. Zhao?
I think I want to echo what Lee said earlier. Currently, if we currently the admission system has been abused. I want to give you one example. A few years ago, my wife and my son went to listen to the introduction by a few admission officers, right? One officer from the University of Virginia, she gave an example. She said, in order to impress the admission officer, right? One boy wrote an essay, discuss, he had a crush with his classmate's mom. And that's called impressive. When we talk about education criteria, right, we need fairness. We need educationally relevant. If not relevant to education, why we allow this kind of admission officer just like play some game, just based on her personal favor to pick this student versus another. So it's not right. I think I agree with, both John and Catherine. If a children actually is growing up in poor community, regardless of his or her race, we need to take a little bit more holistic, way to look at it, and maybe give some preference. I fully support that. I grew up in poor condition. We suffered miserably, during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. But we also try to study hard. But even with that, I fully support, really give some consideration, but need to have some justification, need to be education relevant. We cannot allow, the so-called holistic evaluation, which is invented by Harvard former president Lawrence Lowell during the 1920s to discriminate against Jews. That was history. So we should not allow this become a tool for racial discrimination or abuse, some individual abuse. I'm not saying all the most admission officers are abusing that, but some, the example I heard, is truly abuse.
We talked about other things that are taken into application, athletic status, their children of donors, and I want to move into legacy admissions, which often have a 25 to 40% acceptance rate boost for elite private institutions and generally favor white students. These have often been cited as a discriminating factor in college admissions. What is the role of such policies, if any, in affecting the debate around affirmative action? And we'll start with Mr. Chang.
So there are myths and there are facts around legacy admissions. So statistics you don't argue with, right? It is true that a very high percentage of the children of alumni who apply to the same school will get in. That is true. It is actually a myth that they're getting in because that they have lower scores categorically than other students. right? Because if you think about it, these are kids coming from very, very privileged families. These are kids who are well prepared for school. They're highly intelligent kids. And most of these legacy kids are in fact getting in because they're highly, highly qualified. They know the rules of the game, okay? There's a small subset of those legacies who are getting in because mommy and daddy are donating a crap load of money. And that's just like wrong. That's very, very wrong. I've long supported eliminating legacy preference. The fact about legacy preference, and I can tell you from interviewing for Harvard for 27 years, right? What do alumni children categorically get? All they get categorically is a second read, okay? So somebody will read a file, and there are very few presumptive admits. They'll read a file, and alumni kids will get a second read. That doesn't really mean that they're going to get in because it's so hard to get in now. There are many, many alumni kids who don't get in. So I completely support eliminating legacy preference. They wouldn't even get the second read. I completely support eliminating athletic preferences. I completely support eliminating donor preferences. I particularly support eliminating all of this bullshit because they're being used to justify and as an excuse to racially discriminate.
Ms. Clayton?
So first I'll just speak a little bit to what the student attitudes say, because we did also ask about varsity athlete status and legacy status, and then I have a couple of my own thoughts. But what's interesting is that in our student samples, despite the fact that legacy applicants and student athletes tend to be overrepresented among actual students who are admitted, students do give preference to them. Of course, the magnitude of that preference is smaller than the preference that they give based on academic merit, based on race ethnicity, but there was evidence that we found that students are generally in favor of admitting legacy applicants and athletes. Now, a caveat to that is that these populations are overrepresented on college campuses to begin with, so those people were in our sample, and if you're a legacy applicant or a student athlete who has benefited from that process, then it makes sense that you would be in favor of that process. But even when we separated out our data between the legacy applicants and the legacy students and the student athletes, we still find pro-legacy and pro-athlete preferences. Speaking to my preferences a little, it doesn't sit well with me that if you have a lot of money and your parents just funnel it in, you could get that second read, you could get special treatment. But I think one thing to keep in mind just on the side of university administrations is that these are businesses. It's very difficult fundraising is one of the most important things that universities are doing, and if athletics and big donors are bringing in a lot of money for the university potentially to do good, I understand at least where they're coming from. I don't know that that's fully my position, but it's something to at least sit with a little bit, that this is an important source of revenue for universities in a lot of cases.
Mr. Zhao?
Yeah, I want to say, I came to this country to pursue American dream. What American dream says, each U.S. citizen should have equal opportunity to achieve success and prosperity through hard work, determination, and initiative. So legacy system is a violation of American dream. So I totally reject that. And also I want to give another example, on the CARETech, right? CARETech already abolished the legacy system. They even don't give any preference to even the donors. They still have very good donation. So I think American right way to go is abolishing all the preference. That's also including the racial preference. I only support social economic based affirmative action, really based on the poverty or some measurable really objective criteria. Only support that. I want to abolish all other preference.
I think that the danger of just going to socioeconomic preferences with respect to that is that it omits the existence of racism. In fact, there is racism that exists beyond just socioeconomic status. And if we're accounting for disadvantages, if we're accounting for discrimination, then we have to account for that as well. In terms of the numbers, just how much preference there was, it's hard to get data on that in recent. I don't have the recent things, but there was a lawsuit against Harvard in the 1980s because they were discriminating against Asian Americans. And it revealed a lot of information about these practices. And for example, it showed that legacy admittees and legacy people and athletes had higher admission rates than African American students to Harvard. And the qualifications of the legacy admits and the athletic admits were substantially lower than the regular admitted students at Harvard. And the class rank, which was about 97% for the regular Harvard admissions, was 92% for the legacy and the athletes. And so these were pretty substantial preferences that were being given to the elite. And I want to reinforce just how terrible that is. Because in essence, it's the whole admissions scandal, the whole bribery scandal over Lori Loughlin and everything that raised this whole fuss around the country about how terrible it was. And it was pretty terrible that you had people bribing their way into colleges. Well, legacy admissions were really a form of legalized bribery. Only problem Lori Loughlin did is she bribed the wrong people. She bribed individuals working for a university rather than bribing the university itself with a lot of money, which is perfectly legal and does get you preferences. It got you preferences for Jared Kushner. That's how he got into Harvard. Was his daddy gave a huge amount of money to Harvard right before he was applying to Harvard. And Jared Kushner, who had mediocre qualifications, suddenly found himself now a Harvard graduate. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to be much more aware of, as well as condemning. And I'm glad we have a unanimous, agreement that these kind of legacy preferences need to go. That whatever the debate we're going to have about affirmative action and whether it's just or unjust, legacy preferences are a clear injustice.
You know, John, without legacy preferences, John F. Kennedy would have had to go to Yale.
Good.
Unfortunately, for the sake of time, this will be my last question before I open up questions to the audience. Please keep your answers brief. We've talked about, and we're going to have about affirmative action. Sorry. We touched on socioeconomic status, and some have argued that there are greater discrepancies between people in class standing rather than gender and race. How, if at all, could the conversation around affirmative action be shifted if looking at the topic from a socioeconomic context? And we'll start with Ms. Clayton for this one.
Sure. So, in fact, we can speak to socioeconomic status too from the book results. But what was interesting for us was, if I remember correctly, the magnitude of the effects of decreasing socioeconomic status. So, for example, admitting students in the very lowest income tertile as compared to the middle of the median income, etc. Those were actually even more powerful than the effects of race. So, on average, students are more in favor of the lowest income students than they would be. The magnitude of that difference is larger than it would be for any racial group. So there does seem to be, across students, a pretty broad consensus in favor of increased socioeconomic diversity. Again, all of the effects of any type of underrepresented group were smaller than the effects of merit. So obviously you need to have some degree of academic merit. You're not just going to be admitted because you are a low-income student. But I think that is a step in the right direction to consider socioeconomic status in the context of affirmative action, especially because we know that not every student who is non-white or who is non-Asian is underprivileged or coming from a necessarily disadvantaged background. So yeah, I'll let other people speak up on that, but I think that it's a step in the right direction.
Mr. Zhao?
I think you raised a very good question. I think many times the affirmative action debate focused on college admission, but we really forgot what is really the cause of that. Meritocracy has no problem. Standard tax has no problem. Who has a problem? Many politicians, especially liberal politicians. Example, New York. When under Mayor de Blasio's watch, the proficiency rate in math and English for Hispanic and for black students were only less than half of that of white and also Asian, right? he failed to fix that issue. He wanted to change the admission system in specialized high school. This example, we have a lot of examples in American inner cities. Example, Chicago. If black families worry about next day their children will be suffer gunshot, will they have enough attention to take care of children, help them have a good grade? If they worry about to find 2 or 3 jobs, right? How to create opportunities. So right now our media, our conversation really never focus on the root cause, which is we need to hold the politicians accountable, especially the ones managing the leaders, mayors of inner cities. We need to hold them accountable. Let them improve the K-12 education for black and for Hispanic children. That is what this nation need to discuss. This should be dialogue of this nation, not attack meritocracy, not discriminating against Asian American. We should not be scapegoat for this kind of failing of the politicians.
Mr. Wilson?
I think in terms of talking about class and socioeconomic status, it is important to know that race has a strong connection with this. The book, The Shape of the River, which is defensive affirmative action, pointed out that at Harvard, black students at Harvard were 7 times more likely to come from poor families than white students at Harvard. So there is a real connection between race and socioeconomic status. Ideally, I would like to see colleges pay attention to both at the same time, and I think they can. You can have class-based affirmative action and race-based affirmative action, and ideally have both at the same time. You don't want to have the Obama kids getting preferences based on race. They don't need them. They get the preferences based on celebrity that other celebrity kids get. But you should focus the race-based affirmative action should try to focus on those who are coming from, as much as possible, disadvantaged backgrounds, who are much poorer, and to a great extent that is what colleges in fact do. They ought to do more of it, but that is the reality, that race-based affirmative action intersects with class-based affirmative action.
Mr. Chang?
So I have a couple of points I think to make. First is, what President Bach, he was the president of Harvard when I was a student there. What he points out in terms of the relative socioeconomic disadvantage of African American students at Harvard, it really should never, I think, be used to justify, as I think we all agree about, discrimination against Asian Americans relative to white students, right? In gaining admission, but that's exactly what it's being used to do. Okay. Number 2. I think the Harvard lawsuit, the current Harvard lawsuit. I don't think there was a lawsuit in the 80s. It was actually a civil rights complaint. And the current Harvard lawsuit revealed just a tremendous amount of useful and very interesting information. And some of the data that came out is that. For all sorts of reasons, right? Black students at Harvard socioeconomically are no worse off than anybody else. The vast majority, something like 80% of black students are coming from the upper class or more. And a lot of studies confirm that race-based preferences do not really help poor people, right? At the end of the day, there is a result, and the result is that the black underclass in America, after 60 years of affirmative action, is bigger and worse off. It has not improved.
Yep.
It has not. They have not been helped by race preferences, whereas race preferences really help categorically the elite of preferred classes. They help rich black people, rich Hispanic people. They do not help poor black people. They do not help poor Hispanics, and they hurt the poor disproportionately of the non-preferred classes. Poor white people, poor Asians. Middle class, upper middle class Asians, like my family, right? We were able to jump the hurdles, but the people being kept out are actually the disadvantaged. So I would favor actually expanding socioeconomic preferences in college admissions. I think that will end up, because African Americans and Hispanics are disproportionately poor, that'll end up picking up more black and Hispanic students naturally. What we have to keep in mind, though, too, is that people also need to be prepared. There are huge gaps. When well-intentioned people say, let's give a student a chance, right? Test scores aren't everything, let's give them a chance. Test scores aren't everything, but test scores are something. They're very indicative of the ability to handle certain academic course loads, and in interviewing for Harvard College admissions, we've seen candidates who have SATs, say, in the 500s, right? Really incredible stories, working 30 hours a week to support their families, blah, 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 all sorts of really incredible stories. They would not be done a favor being admitted to Harvard. Somebody with an SAT score in the 500s or low sixes could not keep up with a course load, and they would fail. What society should do and needs to do, what Harvard with $40 billion and Stanford with $20 billion and Yale with $27 billion, what they should be doing, in my opinion, is potentially considering some of these, these people with a lot of grit but not high test scores for special programs. Like there are gap year programs for athletes. I've seen it. Athletes with very low SAT scores, they basically end up going to a 5th year of high school, funded by these prep schools. Why not send kids who are deserving and who don't have the grades and don't have the academic preparation to that 5th year of high school on Harvard, on Yale, on Stanford, right? And making sure that they're academically prepared. I think it sounds like, and it's very heartening, that the four of us are largely on the same page. We all support. You support affirmative action. You really do.
Social economic debate.
Yeah, we all support affirmative action. We all support diversity. It all depends on what it means. I even support, consideration of race. You support consideration of race, right? Plus factor? No. Okay. Okay. He's all by himself here. He's all alone. Okay. But it should be one of many factors, right? As opposed to a determinative or substantial factor.
I believe Dr. Martin Luther King's dream.